Alright, takeoff and landing performance. Let's talk about takeoff and landing performance. Apart from density altitude, takeoff and landing performance is affected by multiple other factors. Let's take a look at them. Weight. As we mentioned before, weight can increase the takeoff ground roll because heavy airplanes need more acceleration to produce sufficient lift for takeoff. You can see the change easily in this chart. At times when the weight is such that you are unable to take off from a particular runway, you will have to reduce or consider reducing the aircraft's weight. One way to reduce your weight is by reducing the amount of fuel you are carrying. Then check the performance calculation or the values with the reduced weight and then see if you are good for the runway. If you are in doubt, it is always good to wait for favorable conditions of density, altitude, wind, and also reduced weight. Since stall speed is also affected by weight, approach and landing speeds will be higher in a heavily loaded airplane. You should remember our discussion about stall speeds and weight from our aerodynamics chapter. After touchdown, the speeds will be higher in a heavily loaded airplane, so the ground roll will also be longer in a heavily loaded airplane because of the additional kinetic energy that must be dissipated by the brakes and the friction between the brakes, wheels, and the ground. Configuration. Configuration can determine the lift and drag characteristics of the airplane. Configuration can be changed to aerodynamically enhance the takeoff and landing performance of the airplane. Large airplanes have a variety of devices that they use for this purpose. We, general aviation airplanes, have flaps. Flaps can be partially extended for takeoff for taking off at lower speeds and producing more lift for takeoff. You can also use flaps for approaching and landing at a steeper descent paths. Now, your use of flaps for landing might vary with the field conditions, the weather, the length of the runway. Normally, use flaps and a lower indicated approach speed when you are landing at a shorter runway, maybe a grass runway, etc. Winds. Winds, we have already discussed and talked about winds and performance. We need a headwind for smaller ground roll distances of takeoffs and landings. Because surface winds will not be exactly the same as the runway or will not be aligned with the runway, we need a method of determining what portion of the wind is a headwind or what portion is aligned with the runway and what is acting across it. The headwind component refers to the portion of the wind which acts straight down the runway towards an airplane. The tailwind component, on the other hand, is the portion of the wind which is acting directly parallel towards the tail of the airplane. The crosswind component is the portion that is acting perpendicular to the runway. Most airplanes have a maximum demonstrated crosswind component in their POH. You need to refer to your POH operating limitation to get that maximum crosswind component. Now you can easily compute your headwind and crosswind components or tailwind components using this chart. Note here that attempting to take off with a tailwind component adds much more to the ground roll than the same amount of headwind component would reduce it. Another insidious effect of downwind approach and landing is the pilot's perception of the speed over the ground. We have a tailwind. Because of that, we will have a greater ground speed. Because of the greater ground speed compared to the normal speed that we are used to looking at outside, some pilots unconsciously slow the airplane down to a speed which might be really close to stalling speed and it might be dangerously low. I myself have experienced this effect and it wasn't really pleasant.